Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here. It's that day. It is that day. And I can't think of anything better to do with it than to look at some art together. Perhaps it'll give us just a little bit of respite from the news. And if you haven't seen the exhibition yet, I hope you will take time to do that either today or another day. So today our focus is on Georgia O'Keeffe. O'Keeffe, as you can see in these two photographs that were made in the 1920s by her husband, photographer Alfred Stieglitz, was a determined and strong woman. She was experimental, both in her life and in her work. And she crafted not only her paintings, but also a life for herself, a life that in many ways put her own needs and her own art first. In her early years, she also served her lover and later husband, Alfred Stieglitz, as a model and a muse. And you see two other photographs by Stieglitz of O'Keeffe here. But let me just say, that's not what I want to talk about today, because I feel strongly that the fate of women artists is so often completely subsumed by their biography, their lives, their loves, their illnesses, their family obligations. Not that those don't count, but should we talk more about Artemisia Gentileschi's rape, or should we talk about her paintings? Or Frida Kahlo's bus accident instead of her art? It's as if many people feel that the artistic talents of these women were only dependent on some sort of sometimes violent incident in order to flourish. And I don't believe that. So instead, I'm going to talk to you today about Georgia O'Keeffe as a painter. O'Keeffe was born in Wisconsin, which you may not know. Her birthday, by the way, is next Friday, November 15th, so I want you all to celebrate and raise a glass in Georgia's honor. She was one of 7 children, and her parents were dairy farmers. She determined very early on that she wanted to be a painter. And she studied first in Chicago at the Art Institute and then at the Art Students League in New York. I'm showing you here with 3 of her sisters, and I want to mention to you here that her sister Ida, who you see here on the left in this very sweet photograph of the 3 girls, also became a painter. And we do own one of Ida's works in our collection, the Variations on a Lighthouse theme that you see at the lower left. Now, if I were going to give you this on a quiz, you might be hard-pressed to tell me whether either of these or which of them is a painting by O'Keeffe. Any guesses? It's the one on the left. This is one of O'Keeffe's earliest known works, something she made at the Art Students League and which still belongs to the Art Students League. But I think you can see how beholden it is in its style, in its subject matter, in its handling of paint to her teacher, William Merritt Chase. Some of you might remember a Chase exhibition here in 2016, which feels like a very long time ago somehow to me. Chase was an important teacher. And he did encourage his students to find their own path. And you may not think that from the still life that I just showed you, but O'Keeffe and many of Chase's other women students and other painters who became modernists later also studied with Chase. So he gave his students the tools to succeed along their own path. O'Keeffe was not the only member of the Stieglitz Circle to study with Chase. Both Charles Sheeler and Marsden Hartley did as well. And if you were going to think of 3 artists who worked in very different styles, those might be among the 3. It's really the sign of a great teacher who enables his students, enables them to flourish, even if that means that they totally reject his style. And I think you can see Chase's style is very different in the copper pot, still life with a fish that I just showed you, or in his self-portrait that you see at upper left. The other thing that Chase was particularly known for was his support of women artists. And you can see him here, right there, in a class of women artists in the late 19th century. He continued that work into the 20th century. And as I said, he was particularly supportive and believed in the potential for women to succeed as professional artists. On the right, an interesting painting by one of Chase's students named Hilda Belcher. The painting shows one of Chase's students in a checkered dress. Everyone thinks that's Georgia O'Keeffe. A few years later, in 1912, O'Keeffe was introduced to the work of another influential teacher, a painter whose career was centered in Ipswich, Massachusetts, someone you might have heard of, Arthur Wesley Dow, who in fact worked here at the MFA as assistant curator of Japanese prints. Dow studied Japanese prints intently, fascinated by their design and their composition, and he took what he learned from them and turned them into a system for artistic self-expression. Creating art, Dow said, was not a matter of mere imitation or of copying, but instead it was a matter of personal expression that was realized through harmonious compositions that were founded and based in simple linear forms, in color, and in the Japanese design concept of notan, which dealt with light, shade, and arrangement of forms. Dow ended up writing a sort of instruction book about ways to create compositions. I'm showing you the book on the right and one page from it with it. The book was first published in the 1890s. It had a tremendous reach and tremendous success. It reached many, many people beyond the people that Dow actually taught in person in his classes in New York or here in Massachusetts. Certainly, we see Dow's principles in action in O'Keeffe's earliest work, and I'm showing you here a watercolor that she made when she was studying at the University of Virginia in the early 19-teens, paired with a number of plates from Dow's book. O'Keeffe's watercolor is carefully structured, carefully designed. The placement of those stairs as if you could enter right into the composition, giving it a sense of depth, but at the same time, it's the surface composition that works so particularly well. Well, after her studies in Virginia, O'Keeffe moved west, and she took a position teaching in West Texas and lived in Canyon, Texas, near Amarillo. And it was there that she started to experiment with abstraction. She was inspired, she said, by the reproduction of a work that she saw somewhere along the way by Arthur Dove, one of his Nature Symbolized series, which we looked at together last week, and which I show you again here on the left, a fantastic series of very completely abstract pastels that Dove made in 1911. And O'Keeffe always said that it was work by Dove that gave her the inspiration and the courage to explore abstraction, which she began in about 1913. Dove had had a one-person show in 1912 in New York, which included these very exotic to a contemporary audience pastels. They were dubbed, the whole series of them, the 10 Commandments. And I think you might agree that O'Keeffe took those commandments seriously. She started to make pictures like the ones you see on the right, charcoal drawings, drawings that she called her specials. a numbered series that both seem to invoke natural forms but are not realistic in any way. Doves was the first public exhibition of abstract art by an American painter, and O'Keeffe was quick to follow up. She sent these drawings to a friend of hers in New York, and her friend showed them without O'Keeffe's permission to Alfred Stieglitz, who exhibited them in 1916. He is said to have said, and it seems to be somewhat specious in further research, "Finally, a woman on paper," which reminds me of something that Degas said about Cassatt, who, when he first saw her work, when he said, "I do not admit that a woman can draw like that." I hope you're seeing that the gender expectations play an important role in all of these women's careers, and the year change from 1900 doesn't make any difference, and the switch of location from Paris to New York also doesn't make any difference. Now, Stieglitz, who you see here on the left in a self-portrait from around 1911, a beautiful platinum print, and was an influential photographer. We looked at a couple of his things last week. He was also an impresario and a leading promoter of the idea that photography could be a fine art and not simply the product of a machine. He was also a gallerist and a publisher, spreading the word about modernism, both European and American, and supporting a group of American artists whom he felt were creating a new American style, taking the tools that European artists had presented them with when they were shown both at his own gallery, 291, and also at featured exhibitions like the Armory Show, that when American artists saw these things, they took those tools and made something particularly American. Let me remind you that this moment in the late teens is a moment of great sort of social anxiety about foreigners. Does this sound familiar to you? About immigration. Immigration quotas were made, and the idea of many was that abstraction was also a foreign style that had infiltrated America, that it should be dismissed as un-American, as if any artistic expression can be limited or captured by nationality. Stieglitz believed that wasn't the case and supported artists who he felt had taken abstraction into an American form, and O'Keeffe was one of them from her very earliest work. And I'm showing you two of her paintings here from 1916 and 17, which she made in Texas. Light coming on the plains on the left, and on the right, Palo Duro Canyon, a place near where she lived that she painted repeatedly in the teens. O'Keeffe in Texas began a period of radical innovation, and the moment when her commitment to making abstract art was firmly established. She also shows an unbelievable mastery of the very difficult medium of watercolor in its freest form, as I think you can agree simply by looking at these two pictures. She was dedicated not only to the visual appearance of things, but to the feelings that they evoke and the mood that happens when you look at them. I have always particularly loved Light Coming on the Plains as someone who all too frequently gets up early when it's still dark. The way that the light just rises is something that is extremely difficult to capture, but we feel it, we sense it, we can watch it happen, but you can't just pick a moment between light and dark. And I think O'Keeffe so beautifully captures that in this watercolor, which unfortunately belongs to the Museum of Modern Art and not to the MFA. Stieglitz showed this series in New York in 1917, and Stieglitz began to convince O'Keeffe that her artistic career would flourish, and by the way, Stieglitz himself would flourish, if she just would get out of Texas and come back to New York. New York was, after all, the center of the art world. Even the, by then, very conservative painter Thomas Dewing, who worked mostly in the late 19th century, had said when he cut out of his native Boston in the 1880s, he said, "If you're not in New York, you're camping out." I just want to show you one of her series of pictures, which I also especially adore. Another thing from MoMA's collection. On the left, a series of evening star pictures. And I want to point out that O'Keeffe often thinks about series and making groups of pictures that develop a singular theme. It's something that, as we'll see, she does throughout her career. Did anybody see the O'Keeffe on Paper show at MoMA last year? Anybody at all? I'm showing you on the right a wall in that exhibition that totally blew my mind, because the curator at MoMA was able to bring together all of the Evening Star watercolors, and I think you can see how different they are and how they express each individual one, this progression of watching the interplay between light and dark. So O'Keeffe did come back to New York in 1918 with Stieglitz's encouragement. Stieglitz also discouraged her somewhat from the use of watercolor, which was often associated in the critics' minds, unless your last name happened to be Homer or Sargent, with amateurs, and particularly with women artists. Get into oils, because that's what people think is important. And in some of O'Keeffe's earliest oils, like the two that you see here, Music Pink and Blue No. 2 on the left from the Whitney, or Blue and Green Music from the Art Institute of Chicago, she experimented with abstraction that wasn't even based on the visual world at all. They were based on music. Music offered a way for expressing nonverbal emotional states and sensations. And this was a moment when O'Keeffe, like many of her contemporaries, experimented with the idea of synesthesia, the idea that the senses sort of overlap with each other, that you can see music, that you can hear colors. And a lot of this comes out of the writings of the Russian-born artist Kandinsky, who had been inspired by listening to a Wagner opera as a young man. And we see this in a variety of media during the early 20th century, concerts where an organ would not only play sound, but would project color. Or in the case of paintings by both O'Keeffe and Dove, for example, the idea that we could capture the sounds of music through painterly forms. Well, O'Keeffe married Stieglitz in 1924 after he freed himself from his first wife. And it was around this time, the early 1920s, that she began to paint one of her best-known subjects, the flowers, like these two, both of which you can see in the exhibition. She magnified them, pressing them into the foreground of her paintings, so close that the hues and textures of the petals and the interior structures of the flowers that were otherwise fairly invisible to the naked eye would begin to reveal themselves. She said she wanted the busiest of gallery goers to be, and I quote, surprised into taking time to look. And she thought that by making them big, people would have to pay attention. She said, when you take a flower in your hand and really look at it, it's your world for the moment. I want to give that world to someone else. By making them big, they couldn't be dismissed. These were shown at Stieglitz's gallery, and in 1922, the journalist Paul Rosenfeld commented in the magazine Vanity Fair that, and I quote, "The essence of very womanhood permeates her pictures." This is not an unusual thing for a critic to say about works of art that were made by women. There was always this discussion over whether a woman was being true to her nature and painting things that had to do, for example, with mothers and children, with floral still lives, subject matter or methods of handling that were delicate and related to women's sphere as these gentlemen saw it. What happened with O'Keeffe's work is, as you probably all know, people began to hang very sexualized interpretations on these works. Comments that cited her use of color and shapes as metaphors for the female body itself, comments that would haunt O'Keeffe for the rest of her life. O'Keeffe said, "Well, I made you take time to look at what I saw. And when you took time to really notice my flower, you hung all your own associations with flowers on my flower. And you write about my flower as if I think and see what you think and see of the flower. And I don't." O'Keeffe didn't just paint flowers. She also painted New York. And if you're interested, there's a wonderful exhibition organized by the Art Institute of Chicago that's now at the High Museum in Atlanta called O'Keeffe's New Yorks. The two themes are simultaneous in her work, and she exhibited the flowers and the skyscrapers together. And in fact, they inform one another. O'Keeffe and Stieglitz had moved into the city's newly built Shelton Hotel in 1924 after their marriage, and you see the Shelton here in O'Keeffe's painting on the left. It was then the tallest residential skyscraper in the world, and its soaring heights inspired a 5-year period of very energetic experimentation with city themes, particularly with New York skyscrapers, as you can see in all of these images. O'Keeffe said, "One can't paint New York as it is, but rather as it is felt." And you do get the sense of experiencing, walking around in this canyon-like city where you're always kind of looking up and feeling at the bottom of these enormously tall structures that we have to remember were fairly new in terms of architecture. We're all used to them, but you can imagine if you've come from a place where skyscrapers had never existed, that all of a sudden this architecture put you in a totally different relationship with the urban city. She made pictures in simplified forms. She was interested in the relationship between the artificial light that you see in works like the Radiator Building at Center and natural light, such as you see in New York Street with Moon on the right. How does natural light interact with artificial? How does the built environment interact with the natural environment? And how does these buildings, how do their shapes change what you see of nature? I think you can agree that this is a pretty interesting positive shape, even though it's the negative space. And that interplay between positive and negative is something that she explores in her whole career and which has its roots in the work of Arthur Wesley Dow. In a way, painting these skyscrapers was a controversial subject for her. And again, nobody's better at talking about O'Keeffe than O'Keeffe. And she said, The men decided they didn't want me to paint New York. They told me to leave New York to the men. I was furious. So one of those men was Stieglitz, and you can tell that their relationship for this and for a number of other reasons was not always easy. From 1918 until 1934, also, O'Keeffe spent part of the year in upstate New York at Lake George in Alfred Stieglitz's family estate. She enjoyed the landscape, as you can see in the three pictures on the right, as well as the architecture of the area around Lake George. The house at the center is actually the Stieglitz house. The top right is the Lake George itself with a mountain landscape in the background. That painting much more easily visible, I would say, in the exhibition itself than in this reproduction. And at lower right, some of the vernacular architecture in and around the estate. She loved being out in the landscape, away from the urban environment of New York. She loved being out in nature. And this is where she starts to gather objects, to bring them into her art and turn into the O'Keeffe that we know the best. She also took over a tiny outbuilding, which she called her shanty, and she turned it into a studio. It was the first studio of her own that she had ever had. And she reveled in working there, despite the distractions of Stieglitz's large, boisterous, and insistent family. But the combined strains of dealing with the New York art world, her growing boredom with Lake George, and a deteriorating relationship with Stieglitz began to take their toll, and she started to imagine a different kind of life for herself. Her desire for solitude, for nature, and for a place where she could devote herself to her art would soon lead her west. Now, she'd been to New Mexico first in 1917, but in 1929, she began to go back, and she spent more and more time there, traveling back and forth between New Mexico and New York City, always aware of the importance of showing her work in New York and being in the art capital of the US. But she found her creativity, really, in New Mexico's distinctive landscape and also in the animal bones she collected there. I should say that the abundance of bones that she seems to have found was due to difficult events during that exact period in the early 1930s. There was abnormal weather, snow, and then a drought that killed a lot of animals. There was a U.S. Forestry Service government project that cut off animal trails to water, which killed a number of animals. And there was a government-controlled killing of wild horses. So the bones, though, didn't reflect all of that death to O'Keeffe. She wrote that the bones seem to cut sharply to the center of something that is keenly alive, she wrote. And she used bones in her art for the rest of her life. To her, they represented the desert's enduring beauty and to the strength of the American spirit, which is alluded to in a painting that she deliberately made red, white, and blue, which you see in the painting on the right. In 1931, when these paintings were both made, O'Keeffe declared in the New York Herald Tribune, "Bones and flowers run together in my mind when I think of the desert." You might be surprised to know that she painted both of these pictures in New York. She shipped back barrels and boxes of bones from New Mexico to New York, back east, and she painted some of her southwestern compositions in her Shelton Hotel and other later apartments. And you're seeing her here at Lake George with a cow's skull, and on the right, in one of their other apartment buildings in New York, the cow's skull mounted on the patio wall behind her. So it's something that she brings east and turns into the materials for her art. And she starts to earn recognition for her work. This is an article that was published in Life magazine in 1938. Georgia O'Keeffe turns dead bones into live art. And the painting that you see in the Life magazine article is one of the ones she painted in New York, a horse's skull with an artificial flower of the type that were popular in the Latin communities in New Mexico that O'Keeffe also brought back to New York. Having a feature in Life magazine in 1938 is a pretty good thing. O'Keeffe in New Mexico collected rocks and bones from the desert floor, and she does make them the distinctive form of her art for the rest of her career. She was completely compelled by this place, and I'm showing you here Red Hills and Bones from 1941, which is in the exhibition. Such a beautiful, untouched, lonely feeling place, she said. Such a fine part of what I call the Faraway. It is a place I have painted before, and even now I must do it again. So she starts to remove herself to New Mexico. And in 1934, she first visited a place called Ghost Ranch. By the time O'Keeffe arrived at Ghost Ranch, the various small buildings there had become a dude ranch, run actually by a woman from Boston, catering to Eastern tourists who wanted a Western experience. They wanted to ride horses, they wanted to see cows, they wanted to live in adobe buildings. O'Keeffe rented a small guest cottage on the property, and she began to paint. In 1937, she would move to a larger house there, and that's what you see on the left. It was called Rancho de los Burros. It was one of many smaller houses on this dude ranch estate. And she moved there in 1937. She bought the property in 1940. And it's this Ghost Ranch studio that she made there that we have featured in the exhibition. As you can see in these photographs, these period photographs, the one on the left with O'Keeffe in it, the one on the right with one of her favorite chow dogs in it, the scale of Ghost Ranch is pretty small compared to the magnificence of the landscape in which it is set. And that disjunction of scale in many of O'Keeffe's paintings seems entirely natural here. The subjects of her paintings were ever present all around her and ever inspiring. I think you can see, keeping the photograph on the left of her before the cliffs that you can see behind the Ghost Ranch house, that she engaged with the subjects that she had all around her. The cliff picture from Cleveland that you can see on the right, and the same subject in the unfinished painting that you can see on an easel in our studio recreation. And here it is in color. If you stood in that patio, like I did, and you turned around, you'll see something else that compelled O'Keeffe, and it's this mountain, the Pedernal. Best known with that name today. It's a local landmark, a distinctive flat-topped mesa that O'Keeffe could see every single day from her Ghost Ranch studio. And it became famous in East Coast eyes, in non-Native American eyes, largely through the works of O'Keeffe. And you can see in our great deer skull with Pedernal, on the right, here is the mountain, which appears over and over again in O'Keeffe. O'Keeffe's work, like in these two paintings, the one on the left from 1941, the one on the right from 1956. She painted this place so many times that its association with O'Keeffe has completely overshadowed the historical, sacred, and cultural meaning that it has for the area's native inhabitants, who call the mountain sipping and continue to resist the contentious idea, which was promulgated by the New Mexico Tourism Board, of calling this part of New Mexico O'Keeffe country. She was, after all, a latecomer to this land, both as a resident and also as an art maker. O'Keeffe continued to work at Ghost Ranch for the rest of her life, but she bought a second property in the small hilltop town of Abiquiu in 1945, and you see that property here. She had long been looking for property that could support her for living there the whole year, one that could support a large vegetable garden, because these places are remote and you can't just run down to Stop and Shop. And needing a large vegetable garden, you also need access to water. So she found a somewhat ruined estate in Abiquiu, New Mexico, that she coveted for 10 years before at last purchasing it from the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. She renovated it, still traveling back and forth to New York City. Stieglitz dies in 1946, and O'Keeffe spent a lot of time back and forth, a lot of time in New York, settling his estate and making very generous gifts of art from Stieglitz's collection, both paintings and photographs, to American museums. She finally moved into the Abiquiu house permanently in 1949, and she began to cultivate her self-image, as one friend put it, as a loner, a severe figure, and a self-made person, which, in fact, she was, although she did have a good sense of humor. What I find fascinating about the house, how many of you have been to O'Keeffe's place in Abiquiu? A couple of you. I urge you to go. It is so transformational in understanding O'Keeffe's work. The Abiquiu house is open to the public, Ghost Ranch is not, but the relationship that you see at Abiquiu with the landscape and with the outside is really important. And I would just show you in these slides that that relationship between internal and external is repeated within the house itself. You can see the covered patio room that's somewhat open to the sky on the left. You can see the giant picture windows that O'Keeffe had installed into this adobe structure that bring the outside in, if you will, both as you're looking from the outside in and from the inside out. She said she bought the house for this black door. "That door is what made me buy this house," O'Keeffe remarked. "I'm always trying to paint that door. I never quite get it. It's a curse, the way I feel I must continually go on with that door." She made about 20 paintings and drawings of this door, some of them representational, some of them distilled to geometric shapes, no two of them alike. And I'm showing you here 3 of them that you can see in the exhibition. She took photographs of it, as you can see in the upper left, a fabulous photograph from our own collection, and also kept repeating the themes, some of them more realistic with a band of sky that kind of shows you a view of more of the house, some of them becoming more and more abstract. And as you can see from my own very awkward photograph on the right, which I took at Ghost Ranch, O'Keeffe saw with much more than her own eyes. The paintings are representational, yes, but they are so much more than that. The fact that I couldn't take a picture that replicates our painting tells you a lot. These are explorations of shapes, of surfaces, of lights and darks, of mass and form, all of these things that O'Keeffe had been thinking about ever since she was first exposed to the work of Arthur Dow. The MFA's painting on the left has the severity of a complete abstraction. And if you'll just indulge me, let me show you another painting that was made in 1955, the same year as Patio with Black Door. This is Barnett Newman's painting called Uriel, which is in a private collection. Newman has been critically regarded as one of the major figures of abstract expressionism, a foremost color field painting, but isn't it interesting that somebody who's considered in a completely different art historical camp than O'Keeffe is actually experimenting with very similar ideas formally. O'Keeffe's home also informs her art in another way. This juxtaposition of bringing together near and far, or as she said, the far away nearby. I took this picture of one of the animal horns that is arranged on the windowsill inside the house, and you can see the way it flattens space and brings both near and far together, something that she explored over and over again in works like this one, Red Hill and White Shell from 1938. And in fact, if I can put it this way, her whole house serves as an installation piece. If we want to look at a different medium in which O'Keeffe worked, I think installation art might be one of them. It's strictly arranged and designed by O'Keeffe, from the placement of the large picture window, which you see on the left, which she caused to be installed, to the severity, but also I think the sensuousness of the adobe walls and the built-in features of the fireplace and the benches. They're very crisp outlines and designs, I think mitigated by the softness that adobe has by its nature. This is hand-built out of clay. It undulates in the light. And it reminds me of the combination of determined outlines in O'Keeffe's paintings that are transformed when you see them in person by the delicacy of her brushwork with its small feathered strokes of paint. And I'd also point out that forms that appear over and over again in her work also appear in the arrangements she put in her house. This is a bench that kind of has a hole in it, so you look down into a display case, and this is a rattlesnake skeleton arranged to be a spiral. And if you go into the exhibition, you'll see how many times, even in the flower paintings, O'Keeffe is playing with this particular shape. Well, she didn't just do that in the rooms where she might have had company. This is her bedroom, equally spare, with its careful display of objects along a ledge behind the bed. This is the room that once contained the MFA's White Rose with Larkspur. You see it in the kitchen and the closet as well. And I have to tell you, my kitchen and my closet do not look like this. This is deliberate arrangement. But O'Keeffe was also intrepid. She didn't just stay in her studio, either in Ghost Ranch or in the Abiquiu house. And she didn't only paint the landscapes she could see from her homes. She called New Mexico's Beastie Badlands the Denazian Wilderness, which you see in her paintings on the screen now, the Black Place. It is what one who didn't enjoy these kinds of severe landscapes might call desolate, part of New Mexico that's now being put under threat by a number of extractions of oil and other things. You might call it desolate, but to O'Keeffe it was simply beautiful. She wrote that it looked like a mile of elephants, gray hills, all about the same size, with almost white sand at their feet. And this place, which was extremely remote, more than 100 miles away from Abiquiu, became one of her favorite places to paint. O'Keeffe learned to drive in 1929. She bought a Model A Ford, and she used it as a mobile studio, so she got out and about. In the 1940s, she frequently went to the Black Place with her friend Maria Chabot, an aspiring writer and indigenous arts advocate who helped manage O'Keeffe's property, and they often stayed for days, camping and exploring on foot. O'Keeffe ignored rock pinnacles and other really weird rock formations that you can find in this area, and instead concentrated on these eroded, striated cliffs. Some of her paintings are recognizable landscapes, like the one that you can see at the top, which includes a strip of sky, so we have a sense of place and up and down. But others zoom in, really exploring depth and color, their overlapping ridges becoming surface patterns that are almost completely abstract and seem to go back and forth in space as if they were optical illusions. And as she had so often done, her repetitions of the motif form a series to abstraction. And I want to show you here two Black Place paintings that are not in the exhibition so that you can see how abstract they get. I would also remind you that these paintings were done during World War II. So their dissolution of form can take on a greater meaning if you read them as sort of the world coming apart. But this reduction of forms to their barest essence is something that wasn't new to O'Keeffe. It's a consistent interest over the course of her entire career, and I'm just reminding you of that with a painting, watercolor from 1916 on the left, one from 1930 at center, and one from 1963 at the far right. One of O'Keeffe's last paintings was monumental. It's this one, which you may have seen in the stairwell at the Art Institute of Chicago, which is about the only place it fits. She was 77 years old when she painted it, and again, it was part of a series inspired by her experiences as an airplane passenger in the 1950s. Not because of Joni Mitchell looking at clouds from both sides. I am showing you one of the other ones in the series at lower left, which is even more abstract than the Chicago one. I had it in my head, she said, something I've wanted to do for a number of years. The scale of this, the manner in which it's painted, is hard not to read as in the same moment as the scale of abstract expressionist art, which is often huge, and also of pop art. It might be her final statement on painting something at the scale of a mural, something that she had started and failed doing earlier in her career. And that's a whole nother lecture about women and mural painting that you're not going to hear today. I want to close by just thinking a little bit about O'Keeffe and her reputation. As we embarked on the show for this fall, we did a marketing survey and learned that the relative positions of O'Keeffe and Moore had entirely switched. Moore was internationally famous, well-known, still well-known to many of us today, but little known by name to the people who took our marketing survey. O'Keeffe, on the other hand, completely famous. How does an artist's reputation shift, sometimes up and sometimes down over time? O'Keeffe worked hard to foster her reputation, partly through exhibitions, partly through the press, but it did take a long time. In addition to the many shows she had at Stieglitz's gallery, her work also began to be featured in important museum displays. In 1927 in Brooklyn, these two paintings, both in the exhibition, were included there. It was a special summer exhibition with a group of paintings by Georgia O'Keeffe. As the press release put it, the subjects of these pictures are the floral and still life arrangements with which this artist has become identified. I already mentioned the 1938 Life magazine spread, which you see here. The cover was the Queen of Egypt. I don't know what that article was about, but not O'Keeffe. But it would serve to make her work recognizable to the public as art. And the articles linked O'Keeffe to the landscape and to the objects she painted, juxtaposing the painting with her collecting of the bones. And I would just point out that that amazing picture of her picking up what looks like a full cow at the left page of the Life magazine article was taken by a friend of hers you might have heard of named Ansel Adams. A large display of O'Keeffe's artwork that marked a first for O'Keeffe was a comprehensive museum retrospective, and it wasn't at MoMA. It was at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1943. 61 O'Keeffes establishing the canon of her work. She knew the curator of that show, who had written to O'Keeffe after they met in New Mexico, and he said, "I have long admired your work and feel that a selection of it showing your changes and developments would be greatly appreciated by our public, already keenly aware of your place in American art." Well, O'Keeffe went to Chicago and she helped out with that exhibition. Or, as the press put it, with Miss O'Keeffe, the hanging of a picture is as important as its painting. She is a slight, wiry little woman with the face of an exquisite, coin-like beauty, done almost in pale sepia, brown hair wound in a coronet, but she loved her heavy paintings in their frames of copper and stainless steel like an automaton. I hope they also talked about the work. The Chicago display is often overlooked because of the MoMA show, which you see here, and I'd like to think that maybe MoMA felt they had to catch up with Chicago. O'Keeffe had been shown at MoMA multiple times before. She first showed 5 paintings there in 1929, Flowers and Skyscrapers, but in a group exhibition. MoMA was best known for showing European art, and there was a lot of controversy about that. American artists very upset that MoMA concentrated so much on European artists and not on American ones, so they tried to catch up with that, showing group exhibitions of American artists. In 1946, this exhibition was her first solo show at MoMA. It was also the museum's second exhibition devoted to the art of a woman. There was a little bit of tarnish on this prize, though, partly because Stieglitz dies during the run at age 86, and partly because even though he promised in the press release, as you can see here highlighted in yellow, to write a catalog for this exhibition, the curator, James Johnson Sweeney, never finished a catalog for O'Keeffe at MoMA. He might have been busy working on another catalog for a different show that year. Well, in the 1950s, O'Keeffe travels fairly extensively to Mexico, where she meets Rivera and Kahlo, to Hawaii on commission from Dole, to Southeast Asia, to Japan, to India, to Italy. She paints all the time. She has another important retrospective at the Worcester Art Museum in 1960, where she meets her friend, fan, and collector Bill Lane, and you can see that photograph on the left, a snapshot taken and found in Sandra Lane's archives just fairly recently. But I think it's really the rise of the women's movement that brings O'Keeffe at last to public acknowledgement and fame. She gets the cover now of Life magazine in 1968 with that painting, Red, White, and Blue, from 1931. On the right, she's featured in a public television series about, at last, women artists in 1977. Where does this all come from? It comes from places in the 1970s that many of us remember all too well. It comes from art historians like Linda Nochlin, asking why have there been no great women artists in January 1971 in Art News, and explaining why there was so little recognition afforded to incredibly talented women artists. The National Museum of Women in the Arts, established in 1981, had been a dream of Wilhelmina Holiday in the 1970s. When you ask people even today, can you name 5 women artists? Thank God O'Keeffe is usually one of them, but after that, people get a little wishy-washy. And of course, there's my favorite, the Guerrilla Girls, who leafleted all over New York and Boston too about women not being featured in major museum exhibitions. So it's this new interest and insistence on the legacy of women artists that I think raises O'Keeffe's profile. She's even given a stamp, finally, in 1996. So they shifts in relationship of reputation between these two artists, between O'Keeffe now famous, Moore now rediscovered in an interesting way in the beautiful exhibition we have in the Gun Gallery, is food for thought, I think. We'll hear more about Henry Moore next week with our colleague Courtney Harris, and I want to thank you for coming today. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. I think there's somebody with a microphone, or there will be, and if you don't have any questions and you want to scoot, that's okay too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this excellent lecture. I'd like to go a little bit more into the background of Stieglitz himself, on the premise that some of the original financial security which helped propel O'Keeffe's career was provided through the Stieglitz family fortune. Where did that originate? How many generations long? What were Stieglitz's own years? We know of how he had sponsored her at 291 Gallery, but there must have been some substance long before O'Keeffe ever showed up on his radar. Could you explain a bit about that?
I can explain a little bit about that, but I am not a scholar of Stieglitz, and I actually don't know the answer to the financial part of your question. Does anybody else? No photography historians in this audience who can tell us that? Stieglitz was much older than O'Keeffe. He was well established both as an artist himself. His amazing photographs from the early 20th century had made a name for him as a photographer. He started a journal called Camera Works, so he was very influential. And he ran the galleries and sold works of art. The family did have money. I don't know where it comes from. I'm sorry. I'm going to go Google that right away as soon as I get back to my office. And he did support not only O'Keeffe, but many of the other artists that he represented who were not necessarily selling well at the beginning of their careers. This was new art. It was hard for people. And Stieglitz did provide subventions for a number of his artists, not just O'Keeffe. That only answers part of your question, I'm afraid. Anybody else?
I have another question about Stieglitz. It was my understanding that he was more controlling of what pieces of art that she did put in the exhibitions, in the beginning especially. And was there a reason that she left for Santa Fe because of him and their, his controlness and et cetera?
So it's interesting to me that everybody's asking questions about Stieglitz. Just saying. They were passionately attracted to each other at the beginning. It was a difficult marriage. He was a very strong personality. He also had a number of affairs. It was a difficult marriage. But she stuck with him. She stuck with him until the end. So did he control what she showed? Every gallerist controls what is shown in their gallery. I would answer your question by giving you a parallel story, which is the story of Edith Halpert, who also became a very prominent gallerist in New York, who pretty much told Charles Sheeler that he could not do photography anymore because she wouldn't be able to sell his paintings if people thought that they were all just drawn up from his photographs. So yes, gallerists control what is shown, and one might even say that Cassatt complained that Durand-Ruel got Monet to paint nothing but haystacks because they sold. So this is something that comes with the dealer system, to be honest with you. There's always some control over what is displayed in public, whether it's a jury at a juried exhibition or whether it's a gallerist deciding what makes sense for them to show that they think they can sell.
Okay, this question has nothing to do with what's his name. You showed the picture of the large portrait with clouds at the Art Institute of Chicago, and on your slide you had that with another painting. I believe it said at the National Gallery. I was wondering, is that other painting at the same large scale as because I've seen the cloud painting. We've both seen the cloud painting.
It is not the size of the cloud painting.
Okay.
And there's a whole series of these cloud pictures, but the one that's in Chicago is bigger than anything.
Yes, we've seen that. But in terms of National Gallery, is that the National Gallery in D.C. or is that elsewhere?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you were asking when I looked at the website this morning so I could get the title right, it's not on view. Okay. Anybody else? One more or two more.
I had another question about that large painting, but from the perspective of what may have inspired it. Was she at all inspired by what Monet's Water Lilies paintings in that series?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think what we're seeing is a trajectory of 20th century art where what you're looking at, the view, starts to be subservient to the flat surface of the canvas. And that's something Monet absolutely explores in the Water Lily series. Remember, those are late. The Water Lily series, he starts painting water lilies. I think the first exhibition of them is 1908, but then he continues through the First World War and into the 20s. So we tend to think of Monet as being firmly in the 19th century, but he's actually not. And that idea of decoration and the importance of the surface design is something that starts much earlier and then is explored by many different artists. And I think, yes, you can put this in the category of what art historians like to call decoration, which doesn't mean decorating. It means making a composition that has a lot of interest paid to the surface design. Does that help?
Right. I also thought it was interesting that they both did their very large works at the end of their lives.
So for those of you who might not be able to hear, it's interesting that both of them did these huge things at the end of their lives. And yes, it is. I think there are different reasons for it, but it is absolutely interesting. One last question maybe in the back?
We have one final question from our online audience. And
my
they
goodness.
ask, can you say more about the Faraway? Was it more of a state of mind or a place? Both? I know that she used the term about her time in Hawaii.
I believe that it's both, a sort of distance mentally and also a distance in miles, if I can put it that way. And, you know, when she writes to Stieglitz, she often writes to him as my faraway one. Does that mean she's in New Mexico and he's in New York, or is he far away in a different way? I think it means a lot of things, and it's a term she uses repeatedly, both in the context of people and also in terms of her art and her compositions. Thank you so much.